We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Verdonk, and I am pleased to be your host for today's webinar. I'm the Director of Community and Strategic Engagement at the School of Public Policy, and I'm also a two-time University of Calgary alumni. I share that today because our webinar is part of the Alumni All Access program, which is UCalgary's annual alumni celebration. So I want to extend a special welcome to all of our alumni joining us virtually today. Our webinar today will feature 3 speakers who will each give a short presentation or remarks on what is going on with the Russian disinformation campaign based on their own expertise. Then I'll pose some questions to them and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And we will also take your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. So if you have any questions at any time, please type them in there. We will moderate them and I will pose them to our speakers. I'll take a moment now to introduce all 3 of our speakers, and then I'll call on each of them in turn to talk about what we're all here today to learn about the Russian disinformation campaign and what it means for both Canada and for Europe. Our first speaker is Professor Jean-Christophe Boucher. JC is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and the Department of Political Science. He specializes in international relations with an emphasis on foreign policy, international security, and computational social sciences. His current work focuses on applied machine learning to understand how the digital world shapes our society. Following JC, we'll hear from Dr. Aaron Ehrlich. Aaron is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. His work addresses the role that information plays in democratic policies, and he's recently published several articles on Ukrainian public opinion, including Ukrainians' view towards pro-Kremlin disinformation. Finally, we'll hear from Lieutenant Colonel Yves Desbiens. Yves is currently assigned as a project officer at the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, Latvia. Before this posting, he was the Chief of Strategic Communications and Effects in Riga, where he was responsible for ensuring the full integration of communications and information aspects of all Canadian activities in support of NATO aims and objectives. So JC, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation now.
All right. Does this work?
Looks good.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll share my screen right here. Share screen. There we go. Share. And I'll start my slide. So thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. Just to do slideshow, start from. All right. So, so this is a bigger study looking at Russian propaganda and Canadian social media. So, as all we know for a while that you know, the Canadian government and you know, allies have been concerned with foreign interference in Canadian information space. One of the issues, and we have anecdotal evidence that, you know, other countries, Russia or even China and Iran have been conducting information operations in Canada, maybe sometimes meddling in elections, even in Canada. There has, at least in Ottawa and around the world, a greater concern on how to deal with these infringement or these operations trying to influence our information environment. And one of the major issue that we have is really to kind of measure this on a quantitative level. We have anecdotal evidence. It's very hard to you know, figure out, you know, how these things are developed in time. So this project really tries to address this issue, essentially trying to measure, you know, how does Russian propaganda spreads and grow into the Canadian information space from a quantitative perspective. So our methodology is really kind of simple. We start from a data collection and management perspective. In this case, we are using Twitter to kind of study this object. We have also a code running on Reddit, on Facebook, on Telegram. So we're doing different kinds of multimodal platform analysis, but this is really focusing on Twitter. Twitter is a good kind of environment to study this. Of course, not everyone is on Twitter. It's really skewed toward a very specific part of Canadian population. However, this is where policymakers are focused. This is where journalists find a lot of their interactions. So it has a kind of capacity to influence policymaking in a much more direct fashion than the other kinds of platforms. So we've collected data and we manage. I'll show you how we've done this. And then we basically go through a two-step process. On the one hand, we start to look at social network analysis. What we're trying to do is really isolate the ecosystems and kind of understand who are the influencers, promoting or being amplified Russian propaganda, and then understand better like how people are connected with each other through this information space. And once we have this kind of data and analysis, then we can go and do machine learning applications to this and kind of read the narratives and kind of understand better how we're doing. So this is really the intersection between, hardcore social science, information, and society, combined with data analytics and really bleeding edge natural language processing, which is one of the things we're trying to promote at the School of Public Policy in Calgary. So the data collection. So what we've done is in fact, we've started to run a code and through the academic product track on Twitter back in November 2021. Through conversations with officials back in Ottawa, there were concerns and indications that the Russians were amassing, and mobilizing troops in around Ukraine, and some folks in Ottawa were starting to be concerned that there might be an invasion at one point. At that time, they thought about how the information space will become like a new battlefield where Russian and Ukrainians would try to fight to promote narratives and kind of include this in the process. We also knew that Russia has an information operations always ongoing. They have short-term goals, promote their narrative, and long-term goals, trying to undermine Western institutions. So they knew that this would be happening. So we ran a code in November and we start to collect data. So when the invasion happened in February 2022, we were already collecting data for a while, and we were already doing and understanding what was happening. What I'm showing you today is really data at the beginning of the war, essentially 1 month before the war, one month after the war, after the invasion, and kind of look at how this is done. The terms that we were using is like Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and then similar declinations in Cyrillic. Out of these 3 months, essentially we have 6.2 million global tweets. We have a lot less in Canadian. Our code is running still, and we're about 25 million tweets at this point. So the first part that we wanted to do is really look at Russian propaganda ecosystem and how it develops and exploits itself in Canada. And what we've done is essentially built what we call the retweet networks. So in some ways, what we're trying to do is map out the interactions between Twitter accounts. Hard-coded into the Twitter data sets, we find essentially links between people who talk to each other on Twitter. So basically what we've done is create this network map of retweets. Each dots that you see on this map are a Twitter account, and each line is actually a retweet. So essentially what we're able to map out is the interactions between accounts. So we don't really focus on what they're saying, more so than focusing on how they interact with each other. And that allows us to kind of isolate ecosystems, information ecosystem, and kind of study more closely how they build themselves, how they surround themselves around influencers, and really the impact of what we're seeing. And what we have here is really a really polarized conversation on Russia and Ukraine, of course. On the top hand side, what you have is really accounts centered around the Canadian government, NATO, and to be honest, Ukrainian Twitter sphere. And what we have is really pro-Ukrainian narratives and conversations. What you have on the bottom is really a different kind of arguments. Here, the placement of dots essentially means, connectivity and closeness. The further apart the dots are from each other, the further apart the nodes or the accounts are further from each other, it means the less they have interactions with each other. The more closely they are to each other, it means the closer they have interactions or similar space. And on the bottom side, what you have is really the kind of pro-Russian or Prussian propaganda ecosystem that are, really far from the conversation. What you have here is really a stark and polarized conversation where there's seldom interactions or conversation between these two ecospace. A lot of people talk about echo chambers, and sometimes this is overdone, but really what you have here is really different kinds of clusters of networks talking to each other and not interacting a lot with other clusters. Then we use what we call like a community detection algorithm that allows us to kind of identify subcluster structure. And what we have and what we found is essentially there's in the pro-Russian, pro-propaganda ecosystem, really two big communities. The first one on the left-hand side in red is really a community around far right that represents the far right ecosystem. It's in red. It's centered around, and I'll show you, influencers associated with American and Canadian alt-right and far right, and they're really around this specific conversation. We also found there's another community that doesn't interact as much with the far right ecosystem, is more like a far left ecosystem that has more direct ties with Russian state media. You can see here that RT.com is part of this. One of the things we also found in that ecosystem is that a lot of Chinese and state media accounts are also connected to this, which tells you essentially that there's a Chinese-Russian collaboration, at least in this case, or at least both of them are exploiting the same ecosystem. What we have here is essentially the top influencers in that space. On the left-hand side, we have essentially the 10 top influencers. These influencers are designed or identified by the level of degree, which is a term in social network analysis, essentially how many connections they have with other people. An influencer is somebody, an account that has a lot of interactions with people, either retweets a lot of other people or gets retweeted a lot. So these people or these accounts are central to the network. They're the ones moving information in between accounts. They're the one really driving the narrative in some fashion. So on the right-hand side, what we have is really the far right, alt-right top influencers. And you see here a lot of American accounts, centered around Fox News, the alt-right, Tulsi Gabbard, Jack Posobiec, who has ties with white supremacists, but also people who go and have connections to Fox News. We also see a couple of Canadian alt-right influencers, associated with the Rebel News, the People's Party. Maxime Bernier is part of this. Maxime Bernier actually gets retweeted by like Russian state media, which I don't think is something to put in your CV. And these are really the accounts that are influential in that space. On the left-hand side, what you have is a lot of accounts centered around a different kind of ecosystem, mostly on the far left, associated with the Gray Zone and Global Research, where are two essentially outlets that are associated with Russian state media. Some of them actually go on RT to comment on Canadian politics or NATO politics. Max Blumenthal, for example, does this. Some of them are Canadian, some of them are American, some of them are French, and a lot of these accounts have been closed now. So in terms of network effect, what we find is that we find really like two different ecosystems that either are amplified by Russian trolls and operators or in collaboration with Russian Chinese operator, one on the far left and one on the far right. One of the main vectors of approach, if you really think about foreign influence, a lot of it comes from the US. And this is one of the conversations we often have in Ottawa, where when we think about the information space, the American information space is the one really driving and influencing how Canadians talk to each other, more so than foreign actors. And this is a greater concern, essentially, that how the Americans talk to each other has an impact on Canada. What we find in terms of influencers is that they come in different shapes and sizes. And here I have essentially like 3 big categories. We have the useful idiots. These are people who, are, tweeting by the hip and have a tendency to maybe frame issues in certain ways that shapes or gets amplified by Russian operators. They're not associated with Russian disinformation networks, more so than they're used and amplified. The Russian operators just see these tweets and say, hey, this fits my narrative. I'm just going to retweet and amplify this. A good useful idiot, Maxime Bernier is a good one when he criticizes the Canadian government's policy toward Ukraine and where he criticizes NATO. I don't think he's connected to any Russian accounts. But of course, the Russians see this and say, hey, this is good. The embassy just retweets it and gets amplified in the network. We also have grifters, people who actually make money out of this. Tucker Carlson and people who go on media and gets a cachet out of their interventions in presenting and promoting Russian propaganda. They're not really associated to Russian state media, more so than making a buck out of it. And then, of course, you have groomed or sympathetic accounts, people who actually have connections to Russian state media that are sympathetic to the Russian cause and promote their narrative. What we see essentially is that Russians, Chinese influence operations exploit the existing ecosystem and divisions in Canada. So what we see is really how foreign actors are using our existing divisions in Canada. On the far right, we see ecosystem around the Rebel News and affiliates influenced by American alt-right. Most of their conversation is staunch institutions, anti-media, anti-government, anti-expert, essentially undermining democratic institution. And Russians find this as a good way to kind of exploit and amplify this. And we've seen the Russians do this in the US, for example, using the Black Lives Matters movement as a way to kind of promote their undermining of democracy. A lot of this ecosystem was developed during COVID and the Freedom Convoy, and they're still around and they still get exploited by Russian operators. On the far left, it's this ecosystem designed around the global research and the gray zone, which is an alternative media. They are sympathetic to the Russian cause. A lot of these actors and influencers have been groomed during and developed during the Syrian crisis. So we see a lot of influencers who were, interacting with Russian operators during the Syrian crisis and have developed an ecosystem in Canada, criticizing NATO, the West, and promoting Russian propaganda. And now they are very useful in Russia's war in Ukraine. So we have really a sense of what the ecosystem looks like. Now let's see what they say. And here what we've done is essentially built a machine learning approach to reading all these tweets. There's millions of tweets. We're not going to read them all. So we're using machine learning to parse and do this. Here we have like a deep learning approach to what we're doing. It's a transformer model. Essentially what it does, it creates a word embedding in a vector space where distance in the vector space is really representing semantic similarity. And then we use like a clustering algorithm to kind of identify groups of conversation that allows us to understand better what people are saying. This is a kind of unsupervised approach to machine learning, and it works pretty well. And what we found here is essentially like 5 main narratives that try to promote, Russian propaganda. The first one and the most important, as you can see, there was nothing before February and January. And then when the invasion was launched, and we see a lot of chatter on Russian propagandists, which tells you that they time their information operations in a way that makes sense with their, on the ground operations. The most important narrative was really trying to make the argument that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the result of NATO expansionism. It was NATO's fault, and Russia was forced to invade Ukraine to essentially push back against this expansionism. And it's the one that is most seen in the literature. The second one was really kind of focusing on NATO as an aggressive alliance and really using Ukraine as a proxy to fight a war against Russia. You can see this right now, and it's still going on, where you see Vladimir Putin making the argument that they're at war against the West, more so than that war against Ukraine, and that really Ukraine is just a proxy and a victim of Western interference. So this is really like kind of pro-Russia. There's also this kind of notion about, fascism in Ukraine. There's a lot of Nazis in Ukraine, and that's why, Russia is going there. It doesn't really hold the ground in Canada as much as one would think, but they still promote this. The other kind of narratives are really interesting. It really centered around anti-institutions and mistrust in liberal government, where here we have, narratives centered around the corruption of the capitalist system, the corruption of Canadian institutions, the corruption of the media, experts, government, and kind of trying to undermine, Canadian support for Ukraine as saying like the elites are in a globalist plot and promoting these things. There's also a kind of mistrust of the liberal government, and this is really like things centered around anti-Trudeau and really focusing, for example, on our Deputy Minister, Chrystia Freeland's association, Ukrainian past, and her family, and trying to undermine Canadian support and saying like, well, the grandfather was associated with fascism in Ukraine. This is why the Trudeau government is doing what it's doing. So really different kind of narratives, and that wanes in time and moves in time. So in terms of conclusion, the framing is largely around NATO rather than the actions of the Ukrainians or the Russians in Ukraine. So it really trying to put the emphasis and the opprobrium on NATO, and really this is the important part of the Russian narrative. It tries to leaves out the agency of Russia and kind of creates Russia as the victim of Western politics. There's also a really big focus on mistrust in institution, and really this feeds into the short-term and long-term goal of Russian disinformation campaigns. The short-term goal is always to kind of promote their own narrative, it's the fault of NATO. But the long-term goal is also to kind of undermine institutions. And what we know now about Russian disinformation operations, that they're always trying to undermine our institutions, trying to erode our trust in democratic institution, essentially, create social strife. And they are exploiting both the far right and the far left on the margins that have these kinds of very anti-elite, anti-institution narrative, and they just exploit this. We also see a couple of arguments about fascism and really trying to promote this, and this is what we're seeing. So it's really an evolving kind of campaign, both exploiting ecosystem that are designed on social media, but also kind of driving narratives with different kinds of goals in their disinformation operations. So I'm going to stop at this.
All right, thank you, JC. It kind of makes me want to go and double check my Twitter network now. Okay, we'll turn it over to Dr. Aaron Ehrlich next to say a few words about some of his work that he's done, especially sort of what's going on in Eastern Europe. Aaron?
Great. You can hear me okay? Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm more going to focus on the behavioral elements here, and more in Russia and Ukraine. So a lot of the narratives that you saw in JC's report are prevalent also in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. But I'm going to focus a little bit more about how people respond to this and what we know. So I've done a lot of work on Ukrainian public opinion, and worked a lot on with colleagues on Russian public opinion as well. And we have a lot of studies in the field now. Hopefully, maybe we can get some time to talk about that during the Q&A. But I just want to preface this by saying that before the war, not the war, but the 2022 invasion in particular, there was also, of course, the 2014 invasion. Ukrainians were pretty honest about their biases about supporting Russia or Ukraine, and they overwhelmingly supported Ukraine over Russia. And there's a lot of discussion about how Russia misjudged this, but there was very little evidence within Ukraine that people were supporting Russia. The majority of the population supported Ukraine and its policies. And what was also interesting, and we ran several studies in 2019, was that Ukrainians were mainly able to detect pro-Kremlin disinformation when asked. And we also ran some studies that are now published with psychologists that actually looked at critical thinking skills. And basically what this means is how actively do you engage with the news material that you read? And like in the United States, where a lot of studies have been run, those who more actively engaged with the media that they read were more able to even more able to detect pro-Kremlin disinformation. And so I think it's an interesting case study. Ukraine itself, Ukrainians were able to detect information at high levels. We might be able to ask from a policy perspective, and I'm sure Yves has a lot to say on this about what we can learn from this. I think a lot of it has to do with institution building and lessons learned from the previous Russian invasion. But what's really clear from the behavioral evidence is that actually censoring Russian media, which is a controversial policy, that is, Ukraine turned off a lot of Russian television. Russian television was banned. They also later banned Russian social media. There's actually a lot of behavioral evidence that decreased the belief in pro-Kremlin disinformation within Ukraine. And just to go back, what we did not do enough, what we did not pay enough attention to was the way that the Kremlin was deceiving its own population. And I would argue that while social media is super important, we focused a lot on social media and didn't focus in the Russian context, particularly on the role of state-run and state-supported television within Russia. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we did prior to the February 2022 invasion, and then if I have time, I'll tell you a little bit about what we did after. So before the invasion, like in the Canadian context, in Ukraine, folks were worried about different types of narratives and different types of stories that the Kremlin and Kremlin's allies were pushing out within Ukraine, and what extent that the Ukrainian population were believing these narratives. And I'm sure, as many of you know, much of the Russia's current strategy is very linked to previous Soviet strategies. And so what we did is we looked at the older literature in political science and political communication, and we took stories that were economically related, politically related, related to history, and related to military reporting on the military. And we gave Ukrainians both true stories in these areas and stories that kind of follow different types of known Soviet and Russian disinformation strategies. So we gave them stories that had a narrative that was an anti-West and gave people stories that were really pro-Russia, building up what Russia did, and also gave people stories that were really trying to undermine the Ukrainian government. And what we saw at the time was that a lot of the stories that Russia was putting out in Ukraine was really trying to undermine the ability of the Ukrainian government to provide reasonable services to their population. And what we found there was that generally, on average, Ukrainians were really able to detect false information put out by the Kremlin and its allies, and were able to say that true stories were true. So this was really, heartening, and made it seem that Ukraine was going to be able to. The population was not buying into what the Kremlin was feeding them. And the one area that there was a little bit less of more concern was the economy. I think that made sense at the time in the Ukrainian context, where Ukraine had a history of problem with corruption and economic mismanagement. We also are, looking towards different types of interventions, and we're working on quite a few of those now. What can actually continue to help from behaviorally populations to not believe pro-Kremlin disinformation. And one of the main areas that's been researched a lot in Western context is the idea of analytic thinking And there's now a bunch of tools to try to actually help people engage more critically with news media. But the underlying question is, are people who are engaging more critically with the media believing true stories more and believing false stories less? And we thought that might be a little bit problematic in Ukraine, since there had been a history in Ukraine of kind of tampered with media and populations that grew up not trusting media, because particularly older populations. And we didn't find that to be the case. People who engaged more critically were actually, just like in Western European and North American contexts, were able to actually even better detect pro-Kremlin disinformation. So again, a pretty heartening story from Ukraine, where we did all this research. And so just to summarize, some of the worries that were present before the war, which was then, I think, borne out in Ukrainians' very strong support for the war effort under currently, is that that Ukrainians weren't buying what the Kremlin had to offer, and they started to build institutions. They had built institutions as a result of the 2014 invasion to combat pro-Kremlin disinformation, and they had also banned Russian TV and social media, which prevented some of the spread of that. Again, that's very controversial with respect to freedom of speech, but there is strong behavioral evidence from papers in political science and other disciplines that banning Russian TV, for example, along the border with Ukraine, decreased the vote share for pro-Russia political parties in Ukraine by 8 percentage points, and that banning social media like Kontakte, which is Russian social media, really decreased Ukrainian activity on those platforms. And if one thinks that decreasing activity on Russian social media platforms is going to increase decrease engagement with that kind of material, then it would follow that would probably also likely mean that Ukrainians were engaging much less with pro-Kremlin disinformation. Now, what's happening in Russia itself is a real puzzle to academics, and is a very interesting case study academically, but is also very disheartening from a policy perspective. I have a lot of colleagues that have looked at why Russians don't look at opposition media in Russia. And it turns out that Russians actually really like the Russian propaganda or state-run propaganda channels. Russians have really increased the production value of state-run television. And so to the extent that, at least until very recently, Russians were watching television, they actually were just choosing to turn off the opposition channels. They don't like them. And so that makes it very hard to influence people's opinion if they prefer state-run propaganda to opposition media, which tends to have a much more factual basis and report more true information. And currently, I think the population generally, much of the population is very depoliticized within Russia, which makes it hard for any behavioral intervention to try to change Russians' opinion, let alone all of the other ethical issues related to that. But I think that we really missed, from a policy perspective, how deeply Russians were either tuned out or were only tuning in to Russian state-run television, and so that there was very little influence on that population. We're currently, just to finish up here, we're currently really interested in this issue and how to influence Russians. We ran a little pilot study to look at Ukrainians who were actually communicating with their relatives in Russia, because there's been a lot of headlines showing how Ukrainians who contact their relatives, the relatives basically don't believe what they're saying, and they just believe pro-Kremlin propaganda. We see that the bag is more mixed than that, but there's approximately 11 million there's 11 million people in Russia with relatives in Ukraine. We see that many of them are indeed in that case where they've stopped to talk to the relatives in Ukraine, or they don't believe what their Ukrainian relatives are telling them. But there are some that do, and so we're working on with various people to come up with different strategies to try to better think about how Russians can come to better understand what's going on outside of Russia. Because as JC pointed out, the narratives that are present in Canada, there are particularly narratives that are tailored to the Russian market that have been very, very steadfast and focused, and that many that are focused on making the Russian market believe them, and many who are paying attention in Russia continue to spout the line. And this is particularly true of older population within Russia, who are going to be very, very hard, regardless, to convince them to change their minds. So in sum, from a policy perspective, I think there's a lot to be learned from what Ukraine has done. And behaviorally, we see Ukrainians' resilience to pro-Kremlin disinformation. Within Russia itself, I would say Russia has been much more successful in either depoliticizing or convincing populations to support what they've been doing. And this has been a bit of an oversight on our part, particularly the role that state-run television has played within Russia itself. I'll stop there so we can have ample time for Q&A.
Thank you, Aaron. That's actually kind of fascinating to hear the different ways that Ukrainians and Russians sort of consume their media and what they understand about what they're reading, consuming. Hopefully we'll get a chance to come back to that in the Q&A. Lieutenant Colonel Yves Desbiens, I will turn the floor over to you for some comments from your perspective in what NATO sort of thinks and thinks about all of this.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited talking about this. This is a topic that I love studying and talking about. So quickly, I'll go over my time here in Latvia, what I've done, and then I'm going to go from tactical to a bit of a more academic field. I'm going to be quick. I'm going to touch on a lot of things quickly, and hopefully it's going to trigger further questions and answers. So I arrived in Latvia just a little over 4 years ago, and I started with the troops on the ground, the battle group as we know them, but I was working with the sidebar Canadian headquarters, and I was responsible for setting up a strategic communication team, a first of. So when I got there with specialists in psychological operation, information operation, civilian military cooperation, myself, public affairs, and a bit of a Stratcom background, as well as some analysts and data analysts and intelligence folks. When we arrived, to be honest, we didn't know much about this whole disinformation, information warfare. And that's because we're not that much exposed, or we were not that much exposed in Canada up until recently. And I think that COVID, the election in the US, when Trump was elected, I think that was the first accelerator where he was bringing up fake news all the time. And then a big accelerator was also the Crimean War or takeover. And then more recently, the COVID crisis. But prior to this, that was still something pretty much unknown to us. So the first task that we had was to learn what was going on in this information environment that we always talked about. And believe me, the information environment in Latvia and in the Baltics is extremely different than the one we are exposed in Canada. So I hope to share some of this first-hand knowledge and observations with you. So the first year really was much more about fact findings and learning what was going on. So a lot of literature was already available, and we reached out to the NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence, which has already done a lot of studies. The Stratcom COE has been established in 2014 prior to the Crimean conflict. And the reason is that the Baltic states have been exposed to this kind of information warfare since the late 90s, and they've been telling later in the 2000s, they've been telling their neighboring countries and NATO that this is the future of fighting. And it is only in 2017, 3 years after the Crimea incident, that NATO published its first strategic communication directive. So really, Crimea was like a big trigger for NATO. And then there's been a lot of additional resources and capability building since then. And we are at the COE responsible for drafting a doctrine about strategic communication. We do not have one within NATO yet. That will be the first of, and it's going to be published before Christmas. In comparison, our Russian counterparts have had a strategic doctrine since the 1960s, and it's been fully implemented in their planning cycle since the late 60s. So why is that? It's that because back then Russia wasn't a match against the US and later on against NATO. Same with other adversaries. From a military perspective, they cannot fight against us. It's a big mismatch. So they're employing what they can, and information, thanks to the increasingly availability of new technologies of information and communication. This is becoming more and more accessible and easier to reach. And why are they using this? It's because that's the future battlefield, information warfare, and strategic communication is at the forefront of this. What we mean when we talked about strategic communication, we mean behavior-centric. It's all about behaviors and actions on the ground, and it's narrative-led. So it's led by how well you can tell a story, and eventually it will influence behaviors as well on the ground, and it's going to impact the decision-making process of your adversary. And what Russia, how do they benefit from this? Well, they're trying to gain a competitive advantage on the world stage. Now, how does that look like in reality? Like JC said, they have a short-term objectives, but they also have long-term objectives. In terms of long-term objective, that's really about their strategic positioning and trying to gain an advantage on the world stage. So this is those big ticket item where they're attacking Western democracies, like our values and everything else, because that's something that is clashing with theirs, and they're attacking this like big ticket item, paintbrush. So they have strategies where when they deploy this kind of disinformation and attacks, it doesn't matter if it's in Canada, in France, in Latvia, it's pretty much the same all over, and it's usually in English. However, the short-term one, I would equate this to being opportunistic. They are extremely well organized and opportunistic, taking advantage of localized issues and values that are deep and established within the culture. I'll give you an example. Just before the war in Ukraine, before the illegal invasion, obviously there was like a momentum and a build-up from the Russian elite, and they were trying to communicate to the Russian audience that there was like a humanitarian disaster happening in Ukraine, a genocide, therefore a need for an intervention to go and save Russian citizens. Also, they've increased bot activities, machine learning, artificial intelligence employed to further disseminate their narrative. So that's what that was towards the Russian population in Russia, in Russian, obviously. And we have a study where we've been tracking for the last few years robot trolling activities. And the few months prior to the conflict, we've seen like a 30% increase in robot trolling activities supporting this kind of narrative within Russia. Same external of Russia. And I'm just going to cover the Baltic countries, so to show you how they are also opportunistic on the short term. So right now, like the 4 battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland are in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. I'm going to cover those 4. So in Estonia, essentially the Russian narrative was taking was spinning off a NATO Secretary General public comments about the deployment of the NATO Rapid Reaction Force. So essentially, in Estonian, the Russian propaganda machine was spinning on this speech, and were telling that Estonia would lose freedom of its own country because NATO was deploying 5,000 troops and they were going to deploy more and take over democratic mechanism. So just showing that Estonia is a puppet state, really, and that they would be better off with Russia. In Latvia, it was completely different. There had been recent announcement of an opening, a new airfield opening. So they were exploiting this, and in Latvian and Russian, because there's about a 35% population of Russian-speaking Latvian in Latvia. So they communicate in both language. In Estonia, they communicate in Estonian. So in Latvia, they were saying really that Latvia was militarizing and it was building forces to attack Russia. And then they also created fake news saying that Latvian armed forces had attacked Russian citizens in Latvia, which was completely false. In Lithuania, it was different. In Lithuania and Poland, they used a migration crisis that was orchestrated by Belarusia. In Lithuania, they said that Lithuania essentially were acting against humanitarian law, and they were attacking migrants and beating them up and so on, and that they used this crisis to build up military troops at the border. And in Poland, they used the old fascist speech saying that Poland had been completely deceived by European fascists, and while Poland was dealing with the migration, the European Union used this to attack them and moves further fascist troops in Poland. So this is the short term versus the long term. They are really opportunistic in taking advantage of this. Now, what stick, what doesn't? Well, it seems that the Baltic states are a lot more, I wouldn't say a bit, a lot more resilient. The population is a lot more resilient to disinformation than many other countries, including Canada, perhaps because of being occupied for so many years by Russian, or sharing the borders and being a constant target for decades. Perhaps they've taken actions longer than we've done, and they've been exposed to this problem longer than we've done. So recent research, we have a recent study at the COE, and it's called Virtual Manipulation Brief. So we've studied since February, we've studied how social media and Russian narrative have been going on. And the number of pro-Kremlin narrative has been shut down totally, either because the population is debunking, refuting, much more active and against the conflict in Ukraine, but also because of many sanctions and all of the actions and the sanctions we've put against Russia to limit their capability to communicate their disinformation. So really, there's been like an explosion of anti-Kremlin narrative, and therefore, Russia, our studies are showing that they've decreased up to 80% their activities in traditional media like Facebook, American-owned media, 80% decrease in Facebook, a big decrease in Twitter as well in the Baltic states. And officially, they've instructed any pro-Russian proxies and officials to redirect their communications effort on VKontakte and YouTube. So we've seen an increase in VKontakte. And why is that? That's because this is an environment, and just to emphasize what Aaron said, the Russian media environment is completely dominated by the Kremlin. And we have studies that have demonstrated this as well, not only in terms of like ownership, but it dates back to several years ago where they have some notes here. There has been several merger and acquisitions of private and state-owned media. They've used the political influence to drive the narrative in the Russian media landscape. They've been financing several information operation narrative supporting the Russian position and the need for war and so on, but they don't call it war. And they've passed many new laws to restrict really the freedom of their own citizen. So right now, I'm conscious of time. I know you probably have a lot of questions, but I would be extremely happy to provide even further case studies of disinformation in Latvia, how we are countering them now that we know how they are operating in a local environment. How do we counter this? How do we go from being reactive when there's a disinformation piece attacking us to being proactive? And in this field, proactive means really pre-bunking. It means making sure that whatever disinformation campaign they launch against us, it will not stick. So it goes from population resilience, media literacy, technology literacy. It goes from like further research, further cooperation and collaboration amongst multidisciplinary teams, and a credible source of information, and so on. And I have plenty of studies. Everything I've talked about, we have studies to support this. So I'll be happy to refer you to them as well. I will stop here and happy to further discuss.
Thank you so much. That's it. It's just so interesting just to hear about what's going on in the ground and how sophisticated the machine really is. So I'll ask all of our speakers to turn on their cameras and their mics, and we'll start with some questions. I've got a couple here, and we've got a few coming in online. And just a reminder, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please share them in the Q&A, and I will get them read out to our panelists so that they can discuss. So I'm curious. I want to start with this question about in JC, in the recent work. One of the themes was sort of blame NATO, if you will. Why would that be? Is that coming from within Russia? And then my question for Aaron is, do you see that same narrative within Russia, or is that just something that's reserved for the Western propaganda machine?
It's a good question, and all of this blame NATO, and NATO is responsible for Russia action is a very interesting narrative, and you actually see it right now. So in the last couple of week, you've seen a lot of pro-Russian propagandists, even like people like Noam Chomsky or Roger Waters, coming out and essentially making the argument that the West was pushing for a nuclear war, essentially saying that the West was responsible in kind of forcing Russia to use nuclear weapons. So I think from the perspective, it kind of shifts the blame and the agency from Russian to kind of NATO like responsibilities. It also kind of feeds into the peace movement. So you actually see an intersection between a lot of peace movements who wants to kind of focus on diplomatic relations into like that kind of thing, and exploits this part. It's a really like a short-term narrative and a short-term kind of argument, really trying to build the sense that Russia is just a victim and has to kind of focus on this. So I think this is the important part. Does it stick in Canada? Yes. And somewhat like, so the question is always, does it really have an impact in Canada or not? And it's like, I think on aggregate, I would say like 80% of what we see, and most Canadians are impervious to Russian propaganda, but it has an impact on the margins. And maybe this is where we have to be kind of worried about this. If you think about mis and disinformation as a vulnerable population problem, where we have some people within the Canadian society who are more susceptible to mis and disinformation, then you have to kind of also address these issues. You can't say like, well, 80% of us are inoculated, so we're going to just say like this 20%, we're just going to not interact with them. But what we see is that some of this narrative leaks out in mainstream media, less so in English, but somewhat in French. If you read the French media, you actually see people and intellectuals and journalists and academics actually like writing papers saying like, why are we pushing Russia in the corner? Why are we, putting diplomacy off the table? Why do we are we forcing Russia to a nuclear war? And this really kind of helps make this argument. I don't see it as much in English Canada, in anywhere in mainstream media, neither like from CBC to National Post. I don't actually see this argument as much. And I don't know what's happening in Francophone intellectual circles, which, you know, maybe one day I'll write a paper on that.
Just first to say, and you know, Yves will probably have better say it than me, the Russian NATO narrative is total BS. It doesn't represent, you know, NATO, the way that NATO functions, or how one joins NATO, or anything else. So let's get that. Let's be clear about that. It also totally takes away Ukraine's agency to choose anything about its future. So this narrative is BS. I highly recommend, if people are really interested in this topic, following Paul Good on Twitter. He's a professor at Carleton. And he's really shown how the Russian narrative has changed over time. But the narrative about NATO has been continuous and continues to be very strong in Russia, in answer to your question, and has been really ramped up even more so recently in a lot of Putin's statements. So yes, this is very, very, very powerfully present in the Russian state media.
So maybe it's a bit of a follow-up to, I mean, to this theme in particular, but maybe more in general is, so should we in the West, whatever that might mean, try to refute some of these claims, or does that just amplify it and make things worse?
I'll share a quick story here about refuting statements. It's a very on this. I'll just name a study we have, and it's called Inoculation Theory and Misinformation, and we are exploring whether or not it's a good thing to debunk or to refute something. And in a couple of years ago, we knew that when COVID started, the Russian would target us with disinformation, blaming NATO troops for spreading the virus in Latvia. So really, like from the beginning, we tried to lay as many defenses as possible within the whole society to make sure that they knew what we were doing, the measures in place to protect the soldiers and the population and so on. And this is called pre-bunking, making sure that we lay as many defenses because we knew it was coming. Nonetheless, after a few months, they still attacked us with like a completely made up stories, saying Canadians were responsible and making up numbers and so on, responsible for spreading COVID and whatnot. But still, we knew that this was something we had to debunk, we had to counter, because the trust of the Latvian population towards our presence is key to our mission. The day that the population doesn't want us anymore, we have to leave, because they have a democratic process and values that empower the population to make change at the government level. So this is what Russia is exploiting, and this is what we had to protect. So when they came out with their piece, within 2 hours, we had the Minister of National Defense here in Latvia, alongside the battle group commander, debunking this, and they referred back to many of the public statements and open source information, data from other trusted agents that was available. And then that didn't stick. And then that news story was killed in Latvia right away, within a couple of hours. Latvia also has laws against disinformation and the creation and the spread of it, which many countries don't have. It enabled Latvia to go back to the source where this disinformation piece was created and disseminated, and they were able to take it down. And they had proper tools to take it down as well. Nonetheless, we had to answer to tons of media queries all around the world following this. And within the week, we had 27 international headlines about this story in Latvia. So when you choose about debunking something, you need to be sure why you're doing it. Secondly, it doesn't mean that it's not going to create like a snowball effect. In our case, it absolutely did. Nonetheless, we had to do this. Lastly, we don't just wing this decision. Do we answer or not? We need a countering disinformation workflow already established at all of the government instances but not only within the government, but within the broad society. In Latvia, the talk is happening within the whole of society. We need to do this and emulate this kind of model elsewhere as well. This is how we can successfully debunk.
That makes sense. It would be difficult. Is there any efforts by the West to counter or provide maybe our own propaganda within Russia? Is that one alternative to countering that narrative within the country?
Quickly, from a NATO perspective, we focus on our own NATO audiences. We don't reach out to a Russian population. We're not present on Z-Contact, for example, and so on. We have our own targeted audience or audience of interest, I'd like to say. But in the current conflict, the current war in Ukraine, yes, Ukraine, although not NATO, their main strategy is to reach out to the Russian troops on the ground and the Russian population. Their center of gravity is the morale of the Russian troops. And Napoleon said it many, many years ago, the morale versus the physique, it's 3-to-1. You can achieve greater effects on the ground if you manage to attack the morale of the troops. And this is the main strategy of the Ukrainian Stratcom team and government.
So we've got a few questions here with a similar theme, which is around, on one hand, is the West at a bit of a disadvantage because we don't control media the same way, whereas Russia and China sort of can control the messaging. Are we at a disadvantage there? And is there anything that we can do to level the playing field? And then on the other hand, there's the question about freedom of information and freedom of speech, and that's a significant Western value. So how do we balance that? We heard from Aaron that it clearly has worked in parts of Ukraine to sort of limit the spread of some of this information, but how do we find a balance between those two?
I can try to take a stab at this. I'd say everyone in the West is trying to answer this question, and everyone is really concerned about all of these issues. And when we do comparative studies on how different Western countries are addressing misinformation, from Australia to France to UK to the US and Canada, there's a lot of different attitudes and ways of doing this. And in some respect, I think it is true, right? Like our dedication to freedom of speech actually makes us a little bit more vulnerable to that kind of environment. And we don't want to get into an environment where we dictate speech and we kind of censor ourselves too much. We want as much, as much openness as we can. However, I think there's also I think some sort of utopian view of what the freedom of the press and freedom of the speech is. And I think we sometimes kind of forget that there are a lot of laws around freedom of speech that curtails what you can say. News organizations have an entire code of conduct that tells them how they should treat things and how they should develop stories and what kind of views there are. We somewhat regulate it with the CRTC. The issue we have right now is that a lot of social media and even alternative media that try to kind of play both games, saying like we're just a content creating citizen-led platform to a news organization, exploit this kind of gap. So there's a need to kind of build the regulations and the laws that will somewhat find ways to navigate those norms and issues. And I think Yves is kind of right. This is a whole of society approach, and I think the Western world and Canada particularly has been complacent and really kind of unaware of what the impact and the effect we have. And every time we try to kind of push on this, it's a difficult conversation. And we're moving in a place where we need to kind of build these walls and build these, tendencies through education, transparency, and different kinds of policies that will help us navigate into the 21st century digital information environment.
So a little bit of a follow-up question to that, and that is about in what ways do Western media outlets maybe contribute to the spread of disinformation? Is the policy of reporting on both sides of an issue, does that create a false equivalency of legitimacy? Or are we still better off to allow sort of an open forum and give adequate time to both sides?
I mean, I think you're grappling with the deep questions of our time in a way in terms of media, and I don't think there's one right answer here. In terms of the current Russian invasion, there's been a lot of criticism from the Ukrainian side on the reporting of giving Russia equal voice for things that are clearly untrue, and so I think we do have to, work on making sure that if you're going to give the other side a platform, that what they're saying is not totally outside. And this goes back to what JC was saying about codes of conduct, is these are really, really super important. And the institutional structure, we've lost a bit with the proliferation of alternative media sources, and how we gain that back is a real open question, I think.
So back to social media for a second. So what, are there further responsibilities or standards that social media companies or publishers need to be held in account to in order to sort of ensure this stuff doesn't get disseminated as widely?
So I think I'll take a stab at this. This is a building, it is building. If you really look around the world, there's like nuggets of things happening where, social media platforms are getting regulated. Especially in Europe, they now have like a process that will really change the landscape on how social media does this. The Canadian government right now has, some sort of regulation to kind of like deal with this issue, and all countries are trying to find ways to kind of regulate this. What's interesting is that the country that tries to the least to regulate platforms is actually the US. And in Canada, they're actually lobbying the Canadian government to do as least as possible in platform regulation. The actual trade representative, the US trade representative in Canada came and said, your laws on platform regulation might contravene to our trade agreement, and essentially, threatening Canada of sanctions because we're trying to kind of create safeguards for our place. However, you kind of see this in the other countries. In Europe, they're doing it. In Australia, they're doing it. You also see that if you've seen the news recently, like Alex Jones from InfoWars is starting to rip the benefits of undermining the information space for decades. So now if I was somebody, running an alternative media platform, I would start to be a little bit more cautious about, my accountability and the responsibilities. And it's less and less a free range environment that people think it is. And even in the US now, there might be responsibilities held on these people, and that's going to grow, I think, in the future. And we might end up in a space in 10, 15 years where we'll have a body of legal cases where, spreading misinformation that has a direct impact on people's lives you might be responsible for that and accountable for that. And that's maybe where the future is.
Maybe just to add one thing, I mean, one sees this trade-off in real time right now, where much of the discussion in Russia's invasion of Ukraine has moved to Telegram, because Telegram is unregulated and is specifically unregulated. And so you get to see the other side, the people like Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the autocratic tin pot dictator of Chechnya, is very active there. And so people want to see what these people are saying. And if you completely ban them from mainstream platforms, then people are going to go to see what these people are saying. I go to Telegram to see what he has to say. So it is this very interesting trade-off and a competition among social media about how what regulation, and there's billions and billions of dollars involved in terms of ad revenue related to this.
I will add one last thing here. Three things, and we've discussed today. We had an event, and it's called Emerging Trends in Social Media. This is an annual event we have at the COE, and we had representative from Meta, Twitter's, and a few other big tech, and we always challenge them on what level of responsibilities they have, as they are doing their best, I think, but they answer to a very, very different business model than democracy. They're meant to make money. So let's not be fooled by this. Therefore, I think as individuals and as democracies, we need to do a better job at raising the level of collective understanding towards this kind of phenomenon. And it starts with understanding what disinformation is, something different than misinformation or malinformation. So, and as well, like, and that's a funny anecdote, I'm gonna stop here, but my mom used to tell me that the best lie can be hidden within the best truth. It's all about how you present the facts. And sometimes this is used to manipulate the information. When I was a kid, my mom used to tell me I was the most beautiful kid. And you're growing up and you're thinking, I'm the most beautiful kid. I'm not, right? But in her eyes, I am. So was she lying? Was she not? Depends, right? But it's not. You cannot take actions toward this kind of like, I call it misinformation. So we need to understand a little bit better what it is we're facing. And it's not just about having new legislations and taking new restrictive actions towards big tech that we're going to fix the problem. And in Europe, what GC is referring to is the new Digital Service Act and the new Digital Marketing Act that will come into effect in 2024. It's not so much about restricting big tech, but making sure that they provide greater transparency to researchers, scholars, academics, and so on, and to make sure that they have processes in place to monitor, track, and take down this kind of information manipulation.
So we've got a question here, and Yves, you talked a little bit about Russia's tactics in the Baltic countries. The question is about public opinion and how Russia is trying to influence public opinion in Finland and Sweden. And so are those countries, what are they doing to counter that? Are they doing anything to counter that?
Yes, I've seen this. I've taken some notes down. So recently, obviously, the main Russian narrative is that if they join NATO, there would be great consequences and there would be lives lost and so on. So they were playing on fears. They didn't say what they would do, but they said that it would be extremely detrimental for the citizens of those countries. And they've also started attacking female leadership within the Scandinavian countries. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of female nominated to the highest level, and they've launched hateful attacks against women. So they are really exploiting extreme left and extreme right now in the Nordic countries. And this study expand to ND8, so eight countries being part of the Nordic countries, includes the Baltic states as well, Denmark, Finland, and so on. So right now, that's what they're doing. They're exploiting extreme left, extreme right, and they are using their bot system in a much better way now to target niche audiences. As I said, they're smaller audiences, extreme left and right, but much smaller. And as AI machine learning is increasing in terms of like how good it is, they have to adapt their tactics, and that's what they've been doing, targeting very, very niche audiences.
Interesting. Okay. So how is the acceptance of truth in media different maybe for Canadian audiences versus those in Europe? Is it reflective of our culture here, maybe of accepting media as being a truthful authority, whereas Aaron mentioned in parts of Eastern Europe, the Ukrainians know it's propaganda. Is that why we're struggling more in the West with this?
The only thing I know is that they've been exposed to this information and influence operation for a longer time. And Eastern European, the majority of them speak 3, 4, 5 languages. They don't only have one source of information or one language-based source of information. They read Russian, pro-Kremlin and anti-Kremlin, Latvian, Estonian. They have German. So I think they're a bit more equipped in terms of various sources of information, and also the history of the Eastern countries facing information manipulation?
I think so. We're working with some Asian partners, and they also have a very big ecosystem that is fighting Chinese disinformation in Taiwan, for example. And at the the kinds of things that Aaron was talking about in Ukraine, we see the same thing in Taiwan, where there is a capacity to kind of adjudicate where does the information comes from, and they can smell it when they see it. So when we look from out west or out east, you see that countries that have these kinds of relationships and have been at the forefront of these tensions for a long time have been developing these kinds of attitudes and values and reflexes that allows them to see misinformation when it happens. I think in the West, and especially in Canada, we're less equipped for this, because for a long time I think we felt as if like the information space was a safe space. We were not threatened by anyone, and slowly but surely we're coming to terms with this notion that our information space is also a place where foreign actors are trying to influence our population, and we have to somehow do something with it. So we're 20 years behind the curve. And we're speeding into that process. We don't have a Stratcom team in Canada yet. We're building one. We don't really have a lot of policies around, government strategic communication. Monitoring our information space is really limited in Canada, all across the Canadian government. But we haven't built these institutions, these policies, but we're doing it. It's just going to take time and expertise to do it.
So we've got time probably for one or maybe two more questions. We have a question here about how do we, and I think this is specific to Canada and the West, but how can we, or how should we as media consumers maybe respond to those more right-wing influencers that portray people who disagree as puppets of the government, and they prematurely discredit them right before anybody even gets a chance to listen to what they say? What kind of approach can we take to that kind of misinformation here?
Oh, well, I mean, so like what we're seeing around the globe is that academics, experts, journalists who are working in this misinformation space are getting attacked, harassed online. There's a lot of academics in the US, for example, most of them who actually work on this misinformation are the target of right-wing and left-wing harassment, and also lawsuits. It is part of now of the landscape that those organizations and those people have been able to kind of be free range for a long time, and there's never been a pushback against these notions. And now they're trying to use lawfare and harassment to kind of do this. It's in the nature of the study, and it's going to grow still. I think online harassment is a major problem for politicians, for academics, for experts. COVID-19 made this worse. And the Freedom Convoy and the kind of polarized society that we're living is making this worse. In the grand scheme of things, we need policymakers and leaders on the left and on the right to be responsible and try to curtail the temptation to use dog whistling, to kind of treat each other with respect, and to bring about a greater civic code to political conversations, which we seem to be losing slowly but surely. So I don't have an answer.
No, well,
I think that was the gist of it. I think greater civic courses. I think like Yves is right. Like a lot of it comes through education, and we have to slowly but surely educate our population and participate in debates that makes people more aware of the dangers and really the problems around the information space, to be aware of what is happening, to people think more like critically about what they're seeing and what the information is. It starts from a young age. I think we'll need to do this. Greater education is actually one of those things, and we're doing right now surveys on mis and disinformation, and education is one of the main drivers of shaping people's likelihood to believe misinformation. So we have to kind of focus on that too.
I'll end with the sort of the $1 million question, which is, so what, going back to Russian disinformation, what are we doing about it? What methods are being used to sort of combat this spread, both in Canada and maybe Aaron, you could talk a little bit about what's going on, and Yves, in Europe, because the messaging is different, so clearly the tactics are different.
Well, in the Baltics, they're having a hard time coming up with innovative disinformation tactics. It doesn't stick, and that's because I think we're at a point where we have a herd immunity in terms of disinformation. All countries have what we call elves. So really, there are a bunch of volunteers, civilian, that are constantly combating, exposing disinformation, tracking it, collecting evidences, and attacking those networks spreading disinformation. This is a constant public debate as well. So right now, there's always disinformation coming from Russia, but it doesn't stick. They need to be more innovative. What we're seeing now is an increase of cognitive warfare, where they don't use so much lies and they don't play so much about facts. They're trying to use technologies to manipulate emotions that will then drive people towards adopting a behavior over another. That is the future of information warfare. It's going to move into the cognitive domain, and it's not so much about narrative, but neuroscience and how we can trigger behaviors inside the human minds.
Well, first, thanks again for having me. I agree with Yves. I mean, I think from Ukraine's perspective, I think a lot has been done, but I think still more institution building can be done. But within Russia, I think there's a lot of innovative ways to reach populations that, like, you check Facebook. We've done the infrastructure to identify social media, but we haven't really done a lot of trying to really get to those populations that are most susceptible, who aren't often reading, they're not, up with Stop Fake or some like fact checking organization. I just recently was on a call with a Ukrainian organization. They're being super innovative, placing ads on like Russian porno sites. I think you really we need to think really strategically about the people that we're missing, that are not in the conversation, and to try to actually access those people. Somebody who's sitting at home playing video games in their grandmom's basement, who's getting bombarded with this stuff all the time because they consume a lot of adverts and stuff like that. So I think there's more to be done to be creative in the way that we access hard to reach populations.
In Canada, so we're building these institutions. If you've listened to the government so we were late to the ball, and we had a couple of missteps along the way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of departments in Canada that are responsible for that file: global affairs, public safety, heritage, national defense in some respect, but and so there was a lot of cats and not a lot of herders. And everybody were building their own things, from data monitoring to campaigns. So right now the Canadian government is actually putting in place more structures. Right now, if you've listened the last month, I think the Canadian government announced that they're going to put money toward a more misinformation group. It's going to be within PCO, and they're building that capacity. But we're really at the groundwork of this. We're also, like, the Canadian government and national defense, for example, now is actually building a tool to kind of promote fact checking, and that's taking time. There's still, I think, within the government of Canada, the assumption that the government of Canada can not control information, but somehow there's a top-down approach to how information works. And I think there's a less ecosystem building and more whole of society approach. And we haven't found the kind of right mix of what is the responsibility of the Canadian government. Is it to promote narratives and to fight disinformation, or are they there to, make the ecosystem more viable and let society fight misinformation? What Yves is talking about and Aaron is talking about is more like a societal level inoculation toward misinformation, and it's the society that fights back more so than the government. And I think that's the approach we will have to adopt.
Okay, well, with that, I think we are out of time. I want to thank all of you, our three speakers, for taking the time to share your expertise today. I mean, clearly much more work to be done and understanding how and why this kind of stuff spreads, and sort of, as Yves said, getting ahead of it into the next wave of how this is going to happen. I want to thank the University of Calgary for the opportunity to participate in Alumni All Access. Thank all of you for joining us today. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, and it's a big part of what we do is to facilitate these kinds of discussions where our audience has the opportunity to hear from experts who are living and breathing these issues and become more informed as you make your own policy decisions and elect policymakers. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Visit our website, policyschool.ca. We have a couple other upcoming activities there, and also the recording of this webinar will be available in the coming days. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.